In medieval Europe, a newborn's first breath could be its last judgment. Babies born with visible deformities, missing limbs, fused digits, facial asymmetry, were often not seen as human. They were labeled as portents, punishments, or property of the devil. The Church described them as monstra, creatures born to warn, not to live. A crooked spine was read as spiritual corruption. A cleft lip? The devil's signature. Even twins in some regions were considered unnatural, especially if one died. The surviving child was marked with suspicion. Many of these infants never received names. Some were baptized in secret, only to be buried hours later. In rural areas, midwives might be pressured to take care of the problem quietly. Others were left exposed to the elements in what was called for leaving it to God's will. It was a euphemism for passive execution. This wasn't fringe behavior, it was endorsed. Theologians debated whether such children had souls. Local clergy instructed families to treat them as shameful anomalies. Communities whispered about curses, unclean bloodlines, and divine vengeance. Entire families could be ostracized. Disfigurement wasn't a medical concern. It was a moral indictment. In a world obsessed with order and divine symmetry, the slightest variation in flesh was enough to brand a person, from birth, as wrong. In medieval Europe, deformity was not studied. It was interpreted. The Church, which held authority over life, death, and everything in between, approached physical difference as theological symbolism. A child born imperfect wasn't seen as a medical case, but as a living metaphor, an interruption in divine design. Clerics preached that deformities were signs of sin, either the parents, the communities, or humanities in general. Some were said to reflect pride, others lust, others gluttony. There were entire sermons built around birth defects as visible punishments from God. Monstrous births were recorded not in medical journals, but in moral chronicles. Illuminated manuscripts depicted infants with tails, conjoined twins, or faces too dark, not as people, but as warnings. These images circulated as evidence of God's wrath, omens of coming plague, famine, or war. Inquisitors and bishops debated whether deformed children had souls, whether they could be baptized, whether they could be buried in consecrated ground. The answer often depended on how disturbing the body looked. Meanwhile, early physicians, still heavily guided by religious doctrine, leaned on astrology, humors, or divine imbalance to explain such births. Dissection was forbidden. Observation was limited. What couldn't be classified was simply condemned. In this world, abnormality was not misunderstood, it was blamed. And the institutions in charge weren't looking to protect the different. They were looking to define them as dangerous. For those who lived past infancy, life did not improve. It simply changed flavor, from theological suspicion to public scorn. Children born with visible differences were often denied education, community participation, and even basic dignity. In villages, they were objects of fear. In cities, of ridicule, and in both, of isolation. Some families hid them entirely, not out of care, but out of shame. Others forced them to beg on the streets, banking on pity. Physical difference became performance. Deformity became currency. Cruel nicknames stuck like scars. Beast-born, devil's child, God's error. And with every year, the suspicion grew. Were they cursed? Were they cursed carriers? Could their presence infect livestock, crops, the air? Women with visible deformities were almost never married, unless as punishment or transaction. Men were kept as laborers, if they could function, or discarded into the margins. Those who could speak for themselves often stopped trying. There were no laws protecting them, no categories of disability, no sense of dignity, only endurance. And for some, the only social role offered was that of entertainment. Traveling shows, carnivals, and court jesters turned malformed bodies into exhibition. Laughter replaced cruelty, but not kindness. These people were called wonders, creatures, or signs, rarely humans. To survive being born wrong was not a triumph. It was a lifetime sentence, to be stared at, feared, exploited, and forgotten. Medieval society, it didn't just fear the different, it organized that fear. Local councils issued edicts banning deformed individuals from public festivals, markets, and places of worship. Some cities required special clothing or marks to be worn, not unlike lepers, to warn others of their presence. These weren't laws of safety, they were rituals of exclusion. In some regions, monstrous children were registered separately from standard births, or not at all. Their existence was tolerated only under silence, and often under threat. Violence wasn't only social, it was systemic. There are documented cases of public beatings, ritualized humiliation, and even executions for disruptive deformity. If someone with a difference was accused of another crime, theft, disobedience, blasphemy, their appearance was often cited as evidence of guilt. Their body became a courtroom exhibit. And the church, for centuries, remained complicit. Rather than challenge the superstition, it preserved it. Rather than protect the weak, it declared them symbols. Rather than offer sanctuary, it often led the call for separation. In some monasteries, malformed bodies were considered divine punishment made visible, best kept hidden to avoid further contamination. In others, such individuals were seen as walking reminders of sin, an excuse to preach harder, punish louder, and pity less. What society could not explain, it marked. What it marked, it controlled. And what it controlled, it often destroyed. Fear became law, and law became a weapon against the already broken. In medieval Europe, the body was a canvas, but not for empathy, for judgment. Religious manuscripts, bestiaries, and wall paintings did not depict people with deformities as citizens or souls, but as omens. An extra limb, a tail, a strange face, instantly interpreted as signs of the end times, divine wrath, or unnatural sin. Not medical cases, not human variation, but visual proof that something had gone wrong with the world and that someone had caused it. These images weren't hidden in obscure texts. They were painted on cathedral walls, engraved in woodcuts, told in village plays, and stained into glass. And they followed a pattern: bent spines, blackened eyes, twisted limbs, always paired with demonic figures, lightning strikes, or rotting landscapes. Difference was not depicted as tragic. It was portrayed as contagious. Traveling wonders were sketched and sold as curiosities. Deformed children were copied into pamphlets like omens of future war or famine. Even in death, their bodies were studied, not mourned. These images didn't create violence, they justified it. They gave fear a face. They told the public, this is what sin looks like. This is what God punishes. And so, year after year, generation after generation, the idea settled in that to be born wrong wasn't simply unlucky. It was a message from heaven. And everyone who saw it had a duty to respond, not with compassion, but with distance, silence, or fire. The laws changed. The priests softened. The words monstrous and unholy were replaced in official records. But the gaze? That never left. The medieval world didn't just punish those born different. It taught generations how to look at them, how to flinch, how to stare too long or look away too fast, how to wrap fear in pity, how to call cruelty concern. Today, the language is cleaner. People say brave instead of abomination, unfortunate instead of punished. But the silence around certain bodies still echoes the sermons once preached from stone pulpits. Hospitals now offer treatment, but they still measure value in terms of correction. Society praises inclusion, but worships symmetry. We still whisper about bodies that don't match the template, still classify, categorize, separate, still try to fix what never needed to be broken. What began as theology became tradition. What became tradition turned into aesthetic. And what turned into aesthetic now wears a lab coat or a designer label or a soft voice saying, "It's better this way." But better for who? The medieval punishment for being born wrong wasn't just death. It was erasure of voice, of presence, of value, of memory. And that erasure survived the fire. It just found more polite ways to speak. So no, they weren't cursed. They weren't omens. They weren't Dean warnings. They were people. And history didn't just fail them, it made sure no one else would remember how.